If you've ever felt trapped in that endless top 40 loop, you know the feeling. Same songs, same sounds, same safe choices. Like the world hit repeat and lost the button to try something new. Today, I want to introduce you to a crew that's built to do the exact opposite. Change the station entirely. Bullet End Flight is based right in the heart of the 505, Albuquerque, where the green chili runs hot and the creative energy somehow runs even hotter. And when I say Bullet End Flight, I'm not talking about one single project or one single vibe. Think of it more like a parent company to a whole family of artistic misfits. People who don't fit neatly into the usual boxes, and honestly, don't want to. At the center of everything is a mission that's pretty simple to say, but not always easy to pull off. Elevate the voices that usually get talked over. The artists who get labeled too niche, or too different, or that weird one, too Albuquerque. Whatever that's supposed to mean. If you've ever heard something like that about your work, this is your invitation to pull up a chair. Because that's not a deal breaker here. That's the whole point. Bullet End Flight is built around inclusivity, creative community building, and giving underrepresented artists the megaphone they deserve. Not as a trend, not as a marketing angle, but as the core identity. It's a response to a creative world that can feel gated, filtered, and overly polished, where the most interesting voices get told to tone it down so they can be easier to sell. And here's where it gets fun. Bullet End Flight doesn't believe in staying in one lane. Because why would you? Why drive a sedan when you could take a spaceship? The whole approach is more like, what does human expression look like across every format? And then going after all of it. Let's start with music, because that's a major part of the DNA. The mindset here isn't pick a genre and stay in it. It's more like, what's the vibe, and does it hit? That can mean the spiritual charge of gospel, the late-night pulse of house music, the smooth storytelling and emotion of R&B, or even that classic country charm where life falls apart but somehow the drink is still cold. It's not about fitting into a category. It's about making something that feels alive. But it doesn't stop at music. There's a strong dedication to the spoken word too. Podcasts that get into the real stuff, not just surface-level chatter, and poetry that doesn't play nice. The kind that lands heavy, the kind that says what people avoid saying, the kind that reminds you words can still be dangerous in the best way. Then there's film and TV writing. Getting into scripts that actually have a heartbeat. Not another recycled reboot of a reboot. Not something designed by committee to offend the fewest people possible. The focus is on stories with soul. Stories with perspective. Stories that sound like they came from real lives, in real places, with real edges. And of course, the stage. Because there is nothing like live performance. It's unpredictable, it's electric, and yeah, anything can happen. And usually does. The stage is where art stops being an idea and becomes a moment, right in front of people who can feel it in real time. So why would an artist want to plug into something like this? Because being a starving artist has been romanticized for way too long, and it doesn't need to be the default. And being a lonely artist, trying to build everything by yourself, with no village, no network, no support, That's even worse. Bullet and Flight is about building that village on purpose. The goal is to take the talent that's been brewing in the Southwest, often overlooked, often underestimated, and project it outward. Not in a please notice us kind of way, but in a we're already here, and we're bringing the whole sound with us kind of way. Bullet and Flight positions itself as a launch pad, a safety net, and the hype you didn't realize you were missing. And let's be honest, a lot of people are tired of gatekeepers. Tired of needing permission. Tired of feeling like they have to sand down everything interesting about their work to be taken seriously. If that's you, this is a space that's built for finding your tribe. People who want loud, weird, real art, and who aren't afraid to make it together. If you want to get in the mix, deombase is https://justdominic. And if you want the visuals, you can find the YouTube channel at @justdominic_music. Bullet and Flight Music, LLC is the company behind it all. And the invitation is open. Check out what's being built, listen to what's coming out, and if you're ready to change the station, this is a good place to start.
Across the mesas and the canyon floor, we hear the sound of an open door. Not made of wood, but of a golden line. Not made of wood, but of a golden line. A frequency that's strictly divine. Pulse of the heart on a digital wire, catching the spark and the holy fire. Bullet in flight, heading for the goal. The signals moving through the heavy soul. Bullet in flight, taken to the air. A network reaching near the morning sun. Christ followers moving now as one, as one. Christ followers moving now as one, now as one. The airwaves carry what the Spirit knows over the fields where the river flows. We're building a temple out of resonance, unified in heart and with no fence. From the valley low and with no fence. From the valley low to the mountain high, caught in the stream of the bullet in flight. Bullet in flight, heading for the goal. The signals moving through the heavy soul. Bullet in flight, taken to the air. A network reaching near the morning sun. Christ followers moving now as one, as one. Christ followers moving now as one, now as one. Transmit the truth, transmit the truth. Launch the light, launch the light. One frequency, one frequency, one frequency in the dead of the night. Keep that signal strong, Christ followers. Bullet in Flight Radio, stay to the truth.
There is a tradition older than the Bible that says you were not born empty. It says that before you arrived in this body, before the first breath, before the cry in the delivery room, you knew things. Not instincts, not reflexes, knowledge. The kind that takes a lifetime to accumulate, the kind philosophers search for, the kind priests guard behind locked doors, and then it was taken, not lost, not forgotten in the way you forget a dream. Taken, deliberately, by a mechanism so precise that it leaves no trace, no ache, no scar you can point to. Just a vague feeling some people carry their whole lives that they are looking for something they cannot name, reaching for something just outside the edge of memory. The Book of Enoch describes this mechanism in detail. It names the beings who operate it. It describes the chamber where the process occurs. It records what you carried into that chamber and what you left without. And buried inside the oldest layers of that ancient text is a claim so specific, so structurally precise, that scholars who have spent decades studying it still cannot agree on what to do with it. What you knew before you were born, what was taken, and why the text that describes it was removed from the Bible and locked in a church in Ethiopia for 17 centuries. If forbidden biblical history is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, subscribe now. Every week, we go directly to the manuscripts, the archive numbers, and the ancient texts that were removed, buried, or deliberately misfiled. You will not find this in a Sunday sermon. The Book of Enoch is not a fringe document. It is not a conspiracy theory dressed in ancient clothing. It is one of the most widely attested texts in the ancient Jewish world. When archaeologists opened the caves at Qumran in 1947 and began cataloging what would become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found 11 separate copies of Enoch. 11. That is more copies than were found of Exodus, more than Leviticus, more than nearly every book that survived the editorial council of 364 CE and made it into the canon that now sits in every hotel nightstand. The church removed Enoch from the Bible. The stated reason was theological excess, too much detail about angels, too much specificity about the spirit world, too much information that complicated the simpler framework the council wanted to establish. But if you read the council records, a different concern surfaces. The text named things. It gave coordinates. It described processes with the kind of precision that implies the author either witnessed what they wrote or had access to a tradition that did. That kind of precision is dangerous to institutions built on ambiguity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never accepted the council's ruling. They kept Enoch in their canon. For 17 centuries, while the text was banned, buried, and declared dangerous across the rest of the Christian world, the church at Axum preserved it in Ge'ez manuscripts so old that the parchment required a controlled environment to survive. When a Scottish explorer named James Bruce carried 3 of those manuscripts to Europe in 1773, the academic world did not know what to make of them. Oxford scholars called the material theologically problematic. What they meant was that the text was too specific. Names can be checked, processes can be tested, coordinates can be located. The chapter that concerns us most is not one that gets discussed in documentaries about fallen angels or ancient astronauts. It is chapter 69. And inside chapter 69 is a passage that most Western translations have shortened, smoothed over, or quietly omitted. It describes what happens to a soul before it enters a body. To understand what Enoch says about memory, you first have to understand who the Watchers were and what they possessed before their fall. Enoch chapter 6 introduces them in stark terms. 200 beings descended to Mount Hermon under the leadership of Shemiyaza. They swore a binding oath to one another before they descended, because they understood that what they were about to do was a violation of the boundary between their realm and the physical world. They were not reckless. They were deliberate. They knew the consequences and they chose to cross the threshold anyway. What they brought was the reason the text calls them dangerous. Chapter 8 of Enoch lists what each watcher taught to humanity. Azazel taught the making of weapons and the working of metals. Barachel taught astrology, the reading of stars as signs. Kokabeel taught the patterns of the constellations. Sariel taught the course of the moon. Shamsiel taught the cycles of the sun. Penemu, and this is the one that most translations rush past, taught humanity the art of writing with ink and paper. Literacy itself, the capacity to record knowledge and pass it across generations without the intervention of oral tradition, without the gatekeeping of priests, without the erosion that happens when knowledge moves only from mouth to ear. What this list describes, stripped of its theological framing, is a transfer of what you might call pre-existing knowledge into the human world. The Watchers did not invent these things. They brought them. They possessed knowledge before the transmission, and the transmission was the violation. This is where the chapter on memory begins to open. Because if the Watchers possessed this knowledge before their descent into physical form, the question the text eventually forces you to ask is where that knowledge resided, and what happened to it when they arrived here. Enoch, chapter 14, describes a vision. Enoch is carried through layers of reality toward a structure he describes in architectural detail that has no obvious parallel in ancient religious literature. He passes through walls of hailstones. He passes through fire that does not burn him. He enters a space where the ceiling opens onto something he can only describe as the upper sky, an expanse more vast than anything the physical world contains. Inside this space is a seat, and from that seat comes a voice. The passage in chapter 14 is usually discussed in terms of the divine throne room vision, the kind of mystical experience that later influenced Jewish Merkabah literature and, through that lineage, elements of Christian and Islamic mysticism. But there is a detail in the Gaze manuscript at Axum that the standard English editions, including the R. H. Charles translation of 1906, do not preserve fully. The floor of this chamber in the Ethiopian text is described using a J's compound that carries two simultaneous meanings. The first meaning is the obvious one: a surface, a floor, a foundation. The second meaning is older and appears in the same compound form in only two other places in the manuscript tradition. It means the place of prior knowing, the place where what was known before is held. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the 1983 Oxford translation directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts, noted in correspondence archived at the University of Manchester that this compound was one of the most difficult in the entire text to render in English because the concept it encodes has no clean English equivalent. The closest he could come, he wrote, was something like the ground of original memory. The chamber Enoch enters is not just a throne room. In the oldest layer of the text, it is a storage location, and what it stores is the knowledge that souls carry before they enter physical existence. Chapter 69 of Enoch contains the passage that most directly addresses pre-birth knowledge. It is embedded in a section about oaths and binding, and most readers move through it quickly because the surrounding context is dense with names and classifications. But inside the list of what the Watchers knew and transmitted is a structural implication that the text itself does not state explicitly. It requires reading across the passage rather than through it. The Watchers did not learn what they taught. They remembered it. The distinction matters enormously. The text never describes any of the Watchers receiving instruction or developing knowledge through study. It describes them arriving in possession of knowledge that pre-existed their arrival. The metallurgy, the astronomy, the calendar systems, the written language, all of it is presented as something they brought, not something they acquired. This aligns with a tradition that runs through multiple ancient cultures and that scholars of comparative religion have documented extensively, the idea that knowledge in its truest form is not accumulated but recovered. Plato called it anamnesis, the unforgetting. The soul, in that tradition, knows everything before birth. What we call learning is actually remembering. What we call discovery is actually recovery of what was always already there. The Enochic tradition is older than Plato by several centuries, and it makes the same structural claim, but with a different, more specific mechanism. The soul does not simply forget through the process of embodiment. Something acts on the soul before embodiment to remove what it carries. That something has a name in the text. The name appears in chapter 69 in a form that most Western translations have not preserved. The Gaze text contains a reference to a category of being whose function is described using a word that Isaac translates as the one who smooths. In the context of the surrounding passages about souls and their passage into physical form, the smoothing is not a metaphor for comfort, it is a metaphor for erasure. The being described is not punishing the soul. The text makes no moral judgment about the process. It is simply describing a mechanism, a function. The soul arrives at the threshold of physical existence, carrying what it has always carried, the accumulated knowing of its prior state. And before it crosses that threshold, the one who smooths performs its function. What remains is what human consciousness actually is in this state: reactive, instinct-driven, emotionally tangled, capable of glimpsing things it cannot explain. The sense people sometimes report of knowing something without knowing how they know it. The feeling that certain knowledge is not learned but uncovered. The experience of recognizing rather than discovering. In the Enochic framework, these are not neurological quirks. They are residue, fragments that survive the smoothing, traces left behind because the process, whatever its mechanism, is not perfectly efficient. And in the Egyptian tradition that intersects with this material in ways that are still not fully mapped, these traces have a name. The ancient Egyptian text known as the Book of the Dead is not about death in the way the title implies. It is a guide to passage, a set of instructions for navigating the transition between states of existence. Chapter 125 describes the weighing of the heart, the moment when a soul's accumulated knowledge and action is measured against the feather of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order and truth. What is being weighed is not behavior in the simple moral sense. It is alignment. The degree to which the soul, during its time in physical form, managed to recover its prior knowing and act from that recovered knowledge, rather than from the reactive surface of embodied experience. The hieroglyphic text uses a compound that Egyptologists translate as the heart's record, but which carries in the original a secondary meaning closer to the original script, not the record the heart made during life, but the record it arrived with, the prior inscription. What was written on it before the body received it? This aligns structurally with the Enochic material in a way that cannot be dismissed as coincidence of imagery. Both traditions describe a soul entering physical existence with prior knowledge. Both describe a process that acts on that knowledge before or during embodiment. Both describe what remains as something that can be measured, tested, and recovered through specific practices. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is, among other things, a recovery manual, a set of techniques for excavating what was smoothed over. And several of its chapters, particularly chapters 17 and 64, use language that describes the practitioner not as learning, but as remembering things that were always already known. Chapter 17 opens with a declaration that the text itself attributes to the soul. I am the one who knows myself. I carry the knowledge that precedes the counting. What I know, I knew before the beginning of this form. That phrase, the knowledge that precedes the counting, appears in a different language and a different century in the hieroglyphic inscription on a limestone block that sits in the basement storage of the Cairo Museum under catalog number JE89289, a block removed from public display in 1973. A block that depicts beings labeled with a compound glyph translated provisionally as those who came before the counting of years. The traditions are pointing at the same thing from different directions. The Babylonian tradition adds a third axis to this convergence. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved on 7 clay tablets and dating to the 2nd millennium BCE, describes the tablets of destiny as objects that contain the programming of all that exists. Whoever holds the tablets holds the knowledge that precedes creation, the original script from which all particular existence is derived. The tablets are not static records, they are active. The text describes them as something that must be worn, pressed to the body of whoever possesses them, because the knowledge they contain is transferred not through reading but through contact. The knowing enters the one who holds the tablet and becomes part of them. This is a description of embodied memory, knowledge carried internally, in the fabric of whatever the holder is made of. When the tablet of destiny is stolen in the Babylonian text, the consequence is existential. The being who loses it loses coherence, loses direction, loses the sense of what it is and what it is for. What remains without it is a being that is functional but unmoored, present but without the ground of original memory. The parallel to the Enochic smoothing is structural, the same loss, the same remaining function without the recovered ground. And the Babylonian tradition contains within itself the outline of a recovery practice. The 7th tablet of the Enuma Elish describes a process of recitation performed by the one who wishes to reclaim what was taken. The recitation is not prayer, it is recognition. The practitioner declares what they already are, not what they hope to become, what they have always been, and what the embodiment process obscured. I know what I am, I know what I carried. I declare the prior inscription, and by declaring it, I recover it. This is the Babylonian version of anamnesis, the unforgetting, the recovery of what was smoothed. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE made a decision that is still shaping what the Western world understands about the nature of the soul. They removed Enoch from the canon. They removed texts that describe the soul as pre-existent, as carrying prior knowledge, as arriving in physical form through a process that acted on what it carried. The replacement framework was simpler and institutionally manageable. The soul was created at birth or conception. It arrived empty. It had no prior existence. Whatever it knew, it learned in this life, from the world, from the church, from the priests who stood between the believer and what the church claimed was the only legitimate source of knowledge. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed the pre-existence traditions in Enoch as speculative and dangerous. What he meant was that a tradition which placed original knowledge inside the soul itself was a direct threat to the structure he was helping to build. If people carry their knowing inside them and can recover it, they do not need the institution. The institution needs them to believe they arrive empty. Augustine rejected the pre-existence question on philosophical grounds a decade later, but the practical concern came first. A soul with prior knowledge is a soul with prior standing. A soul with prior standing does not begin at zero, and a soul that does not begin at zero does not need to be filled by the apparatus the council was constructing. The suppression was structural. It protected a monopoly on knowing. The Ethiopian church never accepted it. The manuscript tradition they preserved contains the full version of what was removed. The chapters on pre-existing knowledge, the descriptions of the one who smooths, 3 academic researchers applied for access to the restricted manuscripts between 1988 and 2001. All 3 were denied. When the 11 copies of Enoch surfaced at Qumran in 1947, the scholars who translated the oldest fragments found something that the suppression had managed to obscure for 17 centuries. The Aramaic fragments, carbon-dated to the 2nd century BCE, contain passages about the soul's prior state that do not appear in the shortened versions of the text that circulated in the medieval period. Fragment 4, Q203, catalogued at the Israel Museum under that designation and stored in what is called the Shrine of the Book, contains 12 lines from chapter 10 of Enoch in Aramaic. The lines deal with the binding of fallen beings and the mechanics of judgment. But embedded in those 12 lines is a reference to what the being possessed before its descent that appears in no standard English translation. The Aramaic word is a compound that does not resolve cleanly into any English equivalent. The closest reconstruction, working from the root forms, produces something like the prior inscription of the knowing self. What the being carried before it descended. What the smoothing removes. What the recovery practices are designed to excavate. The fragment sat in the queue of unpublished Qumran material for decades. The scholars managing the publication project, coordinated through the École Biblique in Jerusalem, assigned the Enoch fragments to the lowest priority category. They were finally published in 1976, more than 25 years after their discovery. The commentary that accompanied the publication described the most specific passages about pre-existing knowledge as fragmentary and difficult to contextualize. They were not difficult to contextualize. They were difficult to accommodate within a framework built, over 17 centuries, on the single assumption that souls arrive empty. 3 traditions from 3 civilizations that had limited documented contact with one another described the same mechanism in structurally identical terms. A soul arrives in physical existence carrying prior knowledge. A process acts on that knowledge before or during embodiment. What remains is functional but incomplete. The sense of reaching for something just outside memory is not neurological noise, it is the trace of what was removed. And recovery is possible, not through accumulation of new knowledge, but through a specific kind of recognition, a turning of attention toward what is already there, beneath the smoothing, beneath the layer that the process laid down before the first breath. The Egyptian tradition calls it the prior inscription. The Babylonian tradition calls it the original programming, the content of the tablet of destiny pressed against the chest of the soul before it entered form. The Enochic tradition, in the manuscripts the church removed and the Ethiopian church preserved, calls it the ground of original memory, the substance of the chamber Enoch enters, what sits on the floor that the gaze compound translates as the place of prior knowing. These are not poetic metaphors from 3 separate cultures that independently invented a comforting idea. They are technical descriptions of a process. They agree on the mechanism. They agree on what remains. They agree on the direction of recovery. And they agree on something else. The recovery is not automatic. It requires the kind of sustained, directed, deliberate inward turning that every major contemplative tradition in human history has, in its own language, been pointing toward. What you are looking for is not out there. It was never out there. The sense of reaching for something you cannot quite name. The feeling that what you actually know is just around a corner you have not yet turned. The experience of recognizing something as true the moment you hear it. These are not accidents. They are invitations. Traces of what was smoothed, pointing you back toward what was taken. Enoch does not say why the knowledge is taken before birth. The text describes the mechanism. It names the function. It records the chamber and the one who smooths and how the prior inscription is obscured. But it does not explain the purpose. 2 readings of the omission are worth sitting with. The first is that the text simply does not know. The authors preserved what they could access, and the purpose of the mechanism was outside the scope of what any human observer could determine. The observation is recorded. The purpose is not. The second reading is that the purpose is embedded in the structure of the recovery practice itself. If the prior knowledge must be re-earned through deliberate effort, through the inward turning the Egyptian and Babylonian and Enochic traditions all describe in their different languages, then the taking is not loss but structure. The embodied life is not a diminishment from a prior state. It is a journey from the obscured to the recovered. The forgetting is the condition that makes recognition possible, and recognition is only possible from inside a state of prior not knowing. What is taken is not gone. The ground of original memory is still there. The prior inscription is still under the surface. The tablet pressed against the chest before embodiment still carries its content, obscured but not erased. That is what the text preserved in Axum says. That is what the Aramaic fragments at Qumran contain. That is what the limestone inscription in the Cairo Museum basement encodes in the hieroglyphic system of those who came before the counting of years. The question left at the end of the Book of Enoch, the question that the 17th century suppression was designed to prevent people from asking, is the same question the text was always asking. What would you do if you remembered? There is a manuscript in a stone church in Ethiopia that has not left that building in 400 years. There is a fragment in a glass case in Jerusalem, 12 lines of Aramaic pressed into clay 2,000 years ago, that sat unpublished for a quarter of a century. There is a limestone block in a museum basement with a catalog number almost no researcher has ever searched for. All three are pointing at the same thing. The tradition removed from the Bible is not a tradition about angels and disasters, though it contains those things. It is a tradition about what you are and what you carry, about the process that acted on what you carried before you arrived here, and about the direction in which what was taken can be recovered. It was removed because it placed the most important knowing inside the one who needed to do the knowing. Not in a church, not in a council, not in an institution with a monopoly on access. Inside you, before the first breath. Still there. What the restricted manuscripts contain, and what the recovery traditions across Egypt, Babylon, and the Enochic world share, is coming next. Subscribe so you do not miss it.
True, there's a fellowship waiting for you. Christ Followers Network on Bullet in Flight Radio. Oh, on Bullet in Flight Radio.
Bullet in Flight. Fly. Bullet in Flight.